away from blaring and entrenched inequality and pretend that you're looking at a rainbow. Proposition is going to tell you in today's debate that we think that adequate social cohesion comes after the ills of apartheid have been rectified, something that contradicts the status quo. We're going to be telling you that the rainbow nation ideology is false and that it is principally problematic and it raises the real issues. Secondly, we're going to be talking about how it actively harms and causes regressive transformation. We think the policies that act on this are evidence enough. And Steve is going to be talking to you about how we hurt civil social projects. So firstly, what is the rainbow nation? The rainbow nation ideology. We tell you it's an agenda that was set up during the transition of South Africa from apartheid to democracy that currently exists. We tell you that it had a prime focus on working towards things like non-racialism, multiculturalism, non-separatism. Right? So the historical context that's important to this debate is to understand the fact that it was designed during negotiations between people like SANSDC and Nelson Mandela. Right? It was essentially a way of ensuring that white South Africans were kept happy during the kind of negotiations that happened within this transition. So it's something that necessarily wasn't necessary. We look at the evidence that points towards this, right? Firstly, there was towards the end of apartheid, the kind of violence and racial tension that people claim took place was vastly underestimated. We look at the fact that 70% of an election of a white voting referendum voted to continue the kind of negotiations between black civil groups and the current government. Secondly, we tell you that people like Gavin Ray of Anglo-American consulted with the ANC to design the way forward because of the kind of pressure that's been placed on the government by business leaders, because of things like the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, because of things like US sanctions. We tell you that this kind of unity, this kind of sellout to the white oppressors was something that wasn't necessary, something that was insulting to the victims of this oppression. Secondly, we tell you that because it was not necessary, what makes it worse, that it was actively harmful. Why did we do it? So firstly, we say that it's used in a status quo, right? We say it's something that is principally inaccurate, but importantly, it ignores an intersectional struggle that takes place. We say currently, white families earn 7 times more than black families in South Africa. We say 80% of national wealth belongs to 20% of the population, and this tends to happen along glaring racial lines. We say that what happens then is that even though not all people of color go into South Africa, they are systematically very likely to be. We say something that claims that we are all equal, and we all have an equal stance, we equal opportunity, equal placements in this country, is something that ignores the systematic disadvantage. But then socially, we say it encourages an idea of unity, right? But it encourages a unity that we say is false and apart. We say it encourages people of color to integrate into a still dominant culture, right? We say that it encourages people of color to adopt a culture that was dominant in the past and is still dominant today. It's why we see things like people insulting things like black accents. It's why we see people of initial African heritage adopting things like English names, because they're still forced to confide and convert to a culture that we say a rainbow nation ideology undermines and ignores. We see that as soon as we close our eyes and repeatedly promise ourselves that we exist in inequality, we ignore the fact there is still far too much to do to make this something that we're able to take seriously. But more than that, we say the kind of epistemic inequality that still exists. The fact that most black academics cannot afford to be black academics because they have to make up for the kind of economic and historical injustice. They have to pay off sort of black taxes, they're not able to, they cannot afford to do these sort of jobs. Means that we have a massive descent of the kind of voices that we tell you are able to criticize these kind of ideologies. The kind of criticism that we tell you is paramount to us that kind of economies. So therefore, we tell you it's a lie. But more than that, we tell you it erases the differences that are relevant to the victims and relevant to the identities of these people that suffered these historical horror periods. We say that more than that, they may tell us that it's necessary to tell a lie, right, in order to get the kind of unity that might be effective. But we say that this unity doesn't exist, right? We say that more than that, it's stagnated the kind of development that we think is necessary because of the fact that we're able to pretend as if it isn't that bad, because we're able to pretend that it isn't that necessary, because we're able to look around at because white people are able to look around and look at the mantras that come from parties like the Democratic Alliance about things like racial unity, about things like rainbow nation, that simply isn't true, that is simply undermined. And so the kind of policies that we see are enacted through these kind of ideologies. We see that they actively harm transformation. Firstly, we tell you that they let policies that weren't enough be made to seem enough, right? Be made to seem enough because they're seemingly addressing a lesser problem, because they're seemingly addressing a problem with a nation that is confided in the idea that we all belong, or at least want to belong to each other, but that blatantly isn't the case, right? We see things like BEE being poorly implemented, the poor implementation of this being ignored, right? We see these kind of policies uplifting a few black elites, but most CEOs in South Africa are still white, are still Afrikaans. We tell you these kind of ideologies undermine what needs to be done on, but allow the parties that act them to appeal to some sort of ideology before I move on.
So reparation isn't fully complete, but there still is racial inequality. Tell us why we wouldn't have had some reparation if we didn't have this reparation.
Okay, so firstly, we think that there are ways to understand that we need to reconcile the past injustices and we need to make up for the inequalities that have resulted from these injustices. But by claiming we have already reached that stage, by claiming we already exist within a rainbow region, within which people take up a similar space in a literal group of lines, means that you ignore the fact that this doesn't exist, including the kind of social cohesion that a rainbow nation describes, ignores the fact that social cohesion does not exist and cannot exist until we take active steps towards that kind of existence. But more than that, we sort of things like land redistribution can happen. We look at countries like Singapore, where after atrocities, sort of thing was enacted quickly and sort of thing resulted in extremely positive results. What happened when this kind of ideology was able to be implemented is that it ignored these kind of things on a non-separatist idea. It ignored the kind of redistribution that would have probably made a lot of white people really uncomfortable within the enactment of the kind of reconciliation that we saw. It was important because the kind of capital that comes from things like land perpetuates sort of white wealth domination that we say South Africa cannot stand for. We say that these kind of ideologies allow politicians to get away with this because it allowed them to ignore the sort of harsh reconciliation that we would have preferred. But more than that, we tell you that parties like the DA are able to use this thing as a mantra to justify their lacking transformative stance and their lacking ability to stand up to their white voter base. We say this is something that doesn't happen within a rainbow nation because we do not understand that within that rainbow there are certain colors that are oppressing other colors. We think that's the kind of thing that you're able to get away with when you say this sort of, when you use this kind of rhetoric. But more than that, we tell you that this sort of thing is principally assaultive, right? We say that it's grossly inaccurate. We say that it suggests that everyone is equal in a system that, much like a rainbow, is built on racial colors that are distinct and separate. We say that it allows for any kind of meaningful, pragmatic reconciliation in terms of legislative policies, but more than that, it justifies the kind of empty political gestures that we think have not done enough. So what's wrong with a rhetoric that tells you that this sort of unity is something that currently exists? That rhetoric tells people a lie that they exist within a country where people respect each other, right? We tell you that you're able to appeal to the fact that you live within a rainbow nation where you as a white person live very, very far away in your white suburb from the rest of that rainbow. We tell you when people are able to make themselves feel better as past oppressors by pointing to the kind of mantra that was used to comfort them by politicians during the transformations between these kinds of democracies. We say it undermines the sort of guilt that we think they all feel, sort of guilt that is lessened by the blow of the inclusion that comes from the ideology of rainbow nation. We say South Africans must deal with their ongoing, raging storm of intersectional inequalities. Before you will ever be able to authentically point to rainbows, we need to understand that they cannot and do not currently exist. Western Cape can only win this debate.
This adjudicator though, and it's ugly.
Literally, the funniest thing I could imagine about this finals is if a team from Cape Town came and told us a misdefinition of what the rainbow nation means. It isn't a description of absolute equality in today's society, it's the goal of reaching that point. It isn't saying that everyone is equal within today's society, it's saying that everyone, based on their difference, deserves some sort of consideration within the new society. It says that these people deserve equality. But specifically there, it doesn't advocate for the civilization that they talk about. It advocates for the equality, not of their position, but of their consideration within the new South Africa. We need to understand that moreover, the reparations from apartheid are not finished and are not in the process of being finished. We need to understand that justice is still happening, but what is incredibly important is that the rainbow nation narrative and the ideology that it is based upon was the only reason that we were able to emerge from apartheid into the democracy under which we can then criticize what that narrative meant. That's incredibly important because what we're debating in this debate isn't necessarily necessarily what the ideology means today and what impact it has on today's society, but on what that has meant for the formation of today's society. And on that basis, we're telling you that literally anything is going to be better than apartheid. Ladies and gentlemen, you need to understand what the Rainbow Nation means, because it advocates unity specifically through difference. It says that although we may not be the same color, although we may not come from the same ancestors, we still deserve consideration and equality. What they somehow try to define it as is an idea that we are all perfect within society. We tell you that simply cannot be true, because on the basis, or in the time when it was formed, that equality did not exist. It was not that ANC fighters thought they were equal in the property that they owned to the white presses in that situation. In that situation, it was completely inconceivable that their consideration was equal. What they argued is that that should be the case, and that is the situation that they're fighting for. Like, if they tell us that specifically we need to understand why it was so important for the formation of society, context is incredibly important in today's debate. I'm going to be first engaging with context and then show you why the majority of their analysis is strategically irrelevant. Then I'm going to be telling you specifically how the Rainbow Nation ideology is important to progress in today's South Africa. Let's understand why the Rainbow Nation ideology was core to the dismantling of apartheid. 4 major reasons for this. The first is that we need to understand that there was immense oppression and subjugation of non-white people and people of color across South Africa. We need to understand that this existed in 4 major ways. The first is that political affiliation, basic freedoms like the ability to move, the ability to assemble, the ability to protest, and the freedom of press were completely non-existent within apartheid South Africa. What that meant is that it was almost impossible to organize any sort of movement. The ANC was done behind closed doors with few groups of people without the capacity to organize large movements. That's specifically important in terms of trying to create a new state out of that. It was incredibly important that people were able to engage in that, but specifically that white people were willing to slow down on that subjugation. Secondly, we need to understand that they were facing a powerful and incredibly brutal police state. That black people, whenever they wanted to protest, were faced with brutality, imprisonment, and even death. We think that the constant riots and massacres which we commemorate on an annual basis, such as Youth Day, such as the Marikana Massacre, which should be incorporated, sorry, not that, such as Youth Day, such as various protests, such as the Sharpeville Massacre, these things are incredibly important and need to be acknowledged, that people are currently being brutalized through their protest, that their ability for them to organize was incredibly problematic and damaging to these people. Thirdly, we need to understand that they have the limited capacity for the violent revolution that we suggest, or we believe that they're advocating for, or the control of power within that society that they're advocating for. They weren't correctly clear about that. What that means is that the ANC were currently using homemade bombs that were worked up in a kitchen behind closed doors that were not capable of fighting the apartheid army. That's incredibly important in terms of creating the violent struggle and creating a sustainable state post that. But fourthly, we need to understand that the rainbow narrative is not the black and white narrative. It's not simply that black people are equal to white people. It's more that the divisions within black people and people of color were equally important and deserve considerations. This is specifically important with the climate that we talk about when we're talking about the formation of the post-apartheid state. So when we're talking about that, when we're talking about the Nkandla Freedom Party, specifically dividing itself from the ANC, but more of causing active violence within communities on that basis that the Nkandla Freedom Party wanted violent revolution, the ANC wanted diplomacy and peace. On that basis, the current division in terms of the movement post-apartheid was incredibly divided. Specifically what's important from that context is that violent revolution and state formation was not possible without the Rainbow Nation narrative. Why that is true is because the Rainbow narrative, and this is true for the next 2 levels to prove why that's true. The first is that we needed white people to participate in the dismantling of apartheid simply because of the power that they had. Because even though they list a survey of 70% of people, that's realistically not enough to tell us that white people weren't afraid of black liberation. They were afraid of people being free within their society because these people were actively advocating for violence against them. We understand that violence may have been justified, but that doesn't mean that white people weren't still afraid. What that means is that when you hear about a violent purge of your own family from your country, specifically your death, you're never willing to compromise on your own freedom to try and advocate for equality when you're at risk in that situation. That isn't a justified response, but that is the response that people have. What that means is that white people who currently have control, I'll take it in a moment, who currently have control over institutions, such as the government, such as the police, such as the criminal law system, were not willing to engage with that, but more we need to understand that they would be remaining with the capital in this situation, that they would be fleeing South Africa with the money that they were able to accrue through plunder. Yes, ma'am.
The economy was in shambles at this point in apartheid. The white people were willing to engage, just deal with the analysis that Neil gave to you and the real facts that he gave to you about business leaders and the surveys, all those kind of
No, the apartheid economy was literally based on slavery. We don't think that that's ever going to be a failing economy when you can exploit people as means to an end. That's incredibly important because we think that apartheid apartheid South Africa was, yes, an incredibly struggling time. That's the fourth level I'm going to be speaking about. That doesn't mean that the apartheid army was not incredibly powerful. They haven't responded to this. Secondly, thirdly, we need to understand that unity within the group of people of color was incredibly important. That there currently was no agreement, but more of a growing violence within these communities. That people were never willing to engage with each other, and more people were killing each other in the pursuit for their own society to be formed. What the Rainbow Nation did was it told these people that they would all have a place within the society, and they would all be given consideration. But specifically, the adoption of that ideology, regardless of not whether it represented everyone, the adoption of it was incredibly important for the unification of these people. But fourthly, we need to understand, according to the sanctions that they tell us about, that white people were vulnerable, but they were still afraid. What's specifically important is, in that situation, they were most willing to engage with peace. What that means is that the Rainbow Nation ideology was most effective at that specific time in 1994 or 1990 to 1994. That's incredibly important for trying to achieve change that would never have happened in any other time. Secondly, we need to understand that the Rainbow Nation is incredibly important for progress within modern-day society. But before I move on to that, it's imperative to understand that apartheid would not have ended without the Rainbow Nation ideology, without people believing that they would be united in that new society, but more of the white people being willing to cooperate within those negotiations and dismantle the institutions of power that they existed within. Let's understand why it's important for progress to today's society. Because while they tell us that it's going to be silence and discourse, and shutting down opinions, we don't think that's relatively true. Because that would only be true if everyone understood the Rainbow Nation narrative in their own way. It would only be true if everyone was using it to suppress discourse. What's important is that, yes, that may be true in white Cape Town, but that is not true in the majority of South Africa, where black people are actually involved in discourse. When they're actually telling what their lived experiences are, that's incredibly offensive to argue that these people would be willing to sacrifice their own lived experience because a white person tells them about an ideology, saying that they're equal when they can see simply that they're not. Secondly, we tell you that there's no opt-out from seeing oppression if you're on the other side of the mountain. That if you're not, like in everywhere in South Africa, you're exposed to constant poverty, constant inequality, the failing systems of affirmative action they tell us about, means that people understand that equality does not exist, that needs to be fixed, but more of the Rainbow Nation tells us that that is the goal that we should be aiming to achieve. But thirdly, we told you that we can never, that people are always resistant to asserting a lack of oppression. That if you say that we're all equal, people are incredibly resilient to that. That black people are becoming more, or like engaging with the term of wokeness to a greater extent and shutting down white people when they're trying to explain that to them. What's incredibly important is that the Rainbow Nation narrative was important for the establishment of peace, but more for the protection of the individual dignities of people of color within South Africa. I'm incredibly proud to oppose.
Transformation, real reform is yet to happen. No holy mantra of non-racialism will change that. In my speech today, I'm going to show you why the Rainbow Nation ideology has actively harmed civil society protest. But before that, let's get on to some semantic concerns about the idea of the Rainbow Nation. What they say is that the Rainbow Nation doesn't advocate for things like non-racialism and multiculturalism and unity as opposed to separatism. All that it advocates for is just indicating that people who were oppressed in apartheid deserve respect and deserve rights. This is obvious. Any meaningful policy would include something like this if it were to have any transformation or transition from a post-apartheid into the new democracy. What makes this debate debatable is that the Rainbow Nation was a compromise. It forced the ANC and other civil society groups into a position where they were particularly weaker. It said that it was anti-separatism, so it was anti the ideas of black consciousness. It was pro-unity. That means that it was necessarily informed the idea that it needed to erase differences between people in order to encourage the unification of the country. We think that this problem led specifically to the idea of the misinterpretation of the mantra. People thought that after the apartheid laws were repealed, all of the harms of apartheid were over. And those are the harms that have continued to suppress societies today. It's the reason why we haven't gotten the real reform that we need. So, first response. Let's immediately talk about why we think it wasn't necessary in order for us to achieve a post-apartheid South Africa. So we think that the violence after the end of apartheid is vastly overestimated. Their threats of civil war and this complete destruction of the country is generally a situation of overestimation. What are the reasons for that? We give you two main important examples of situations where it showed that white society was actively willing to participate in a transition towards post-apartheid South Africa. We gave you the example of Gavin Reddy and other businessmen, including chief executives of companies, meeting with the ANC in Lusaka in 1985 in order to discuss the ongoing economic strife that was affecting the country due to the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of the United States. Because of that pressure from white South Africa, there was an agreement and a cooperation that the Rainbow Nation didn't need, or the Rainbow Nation wasn't needed in order to encourage. We think that during the whites-only referendum, this was before the Rainbow Nation was even talked about, it was situations where 70% of the white people respected and supported the reform. So we think that it was easy, and we could have attained a peaceful compromise with the post-apartheid governments without having to subject ourselves to the Rainbow Nation. So, secondly, why do we think that the Rainbow Nation is principally false? They can't tell you that the Rainbow Nation hasn't been misinterpreted by the vast majority of the white South Africans that are still in power. In those situations, many of us white South Africans believe that their work is done. We think that the problem here is that all of these issues still remain. And the reason why the issues still remain is that the government was afraid to make political moves in order to overcome this inequality. What was the Rainbow Nation ideology? It was essentially a bedrock, a policy agenda setting tool and device which was used in order to encourage the transitional policies into apartheid. That meant that there were anti-land redistribution because they didn't think that after the laws were repealed, they thought that it would be a multicultural unified South Africa where no one needed to lose out on anything, despite the fact that black South Africans had lost everything during apartheid. Secondly, we think that it was a situation that was actively made worse over time. We think that inequality between racial groups dramatically increases, and we think that it is a lie to say it now that we live in a rainbow nation. We need to deal with that. We think that in certain interpersonal interactions this causes major problems. We think that the microaggressions that have resulted from this, when white South Africans say, well, we're all equal, why do you think that you have a more difficult time getting into university than me? Since, for example, we have all come from the same background, we're all in the Rainbow Nation. That feeds on these non-racialist perspectives which are offensive to others and something actively harmful. So we think that this is something that has encouraged worse civil society interactions.
Okay, it's not true, right? Just because we think we're in the process of actually being conscious of what the Rainbow Nation is. The Rainbow Nation was not exclusive to black and white, it was also exclusive to Inkatha freedom fighters wanting to opt for violence as compared to the ANC that was willing to concede that there are differences.
So, is that necessarily true? Are we moving our way towards the perfect non-racialist society? The barriers have been placed 20 years after apartheid, and our moves haven't been able to make any meaningful difference. The difference here is that those problems are specifically caused directly by the idea that we're all, the idea that the Rainbow Nation is doing. That's something that's damaging. But let's further respond to this idea of the POI. And what I'm going to be essentially showing you my argument today is that we have oppressive systems as a result of apartheid. Being able to change them has been actively harmed by the idea of the Rainbow Nation. And I'm going to look specifically at civil society protest here. So one of the worst apartheid hangovers is that the Rainbow Nation ideology has infected the way we challenge the existing and leftover oppressive systems. There are three examples of this. Firstly, the fight for free decolonized university education. Secondly, service delivery protests against the incumbent government. Thirdly, strikes against businesses. So why do we think are the biggest problems associated with protesting against these groups, protesting in these contexts? Firstly, is that there are barriers placed to separatism. Only recently have black-only protest movements gained a significant influence and a voice because specifically they've been able to reject the Rainbow Nation measure. For a very long time, it held dominance in the perspective minds of not only white people, but black people as well. Why is that something that's incredibly harmful and incredibly damaging? We think that what it allowed for is it allowed for the inability for these groups to separate and focus specifically on issues that affected them the most. What do we think there are problems with this? We think that there are three problems with the fact that white people have continually occupied space within black-only protests or issues that have systemically affected them. Three reasons for this. Firstly is that there's moral hazard. Is that white people are not affected by the issues that people of color are affected by. That means that it's easy for them to opt out of the struggle without any consequences towards themselves, because it doesn't mean that they're going to be facing the same sort of systemic oppression on a daily basis. Secondly, it means that they drown out voices. Oftentimes, it is involuntarily and voluntarily made that people see white people as a more dominant authority, even on black issues. It's absolutely unmarked, and it's continued through our protest movements all over the country. We think that oftentimes, because of an ingrained arrogance, white people tend to shout the loudest. We think that in that case, it must be necessary in order to form a separate space in order to get those protests. The Rainbow Nation actively harms that because it says that because we are a Rainbow Nation, we should all be able to fight together, and in those instances what it does is it blames black separatism as a form of black racism. Absolutely disgusting. Thirdly, we think that there are perverse incentives involved in this. We think that white people have incentives to protect their own interests. That means they're more likely to dilute the message of civil society and civil disobedience in order to ensure that their position of power is maintained throughout the ends of their protests, throughout the ends of their disagreements. So we think that it is absolutely abhorrent that these problems can be overlooked because of the idea of the Rainbow Nation, the idea that we are all unified and separate in our fights, unified and not separate within our fights against oppression. We think that this is the reason, one of the reasons why it's been so difficult to establish these effective movements, to get the real transformation that we need. Because transformation hasn't come from the government, it's come from the people of the country that haven't been able to move forward because of these barriers. So we think that because it has taken longer to emancipate these individuals from history, it's something that has been actively damaging. So, what have I told you in this speech? I've told you three things. Firstly, it's dishonest and it's unfair to lie to people about the Rainbow Nation, the Rainbow Nation's existence. Secondly, it's something that has actively harmed our abilities to transform. And thirdly, it's harmed people's ability to change their own lives. I'm very proud to stand on side proposition.
Understanding racial dynamic is difficult, and the confirmation of this is the proposition's deficiency in this understanding, but essentially understanding racial dynamic is something that necessitates an opposition that comes the closest to securing something like reparation, an opposition that stands for something like the Rainbow Nation narrative. Because the reality that South Africa has yielded through this narrative, and by extension the reality of South African opposition is one that is not colorblind. It's a South Africa that understands that mechanisms need to be important for the context in which they are created, and furthermore that these mechanisms can change because they're formative, but that they're equally important for the evolutionary importance that they have within different contexts. Before I get into my positive matter, I'm going to deal with 2 points of positive argument, right? The first thing they told us was that true reform was just not a reality in current day South Africa, and this means we should reject the Rainbow Nation Act. We have 2 responses. Firstly, we tell you that the opposition didn't have this burden to prove that we have the ideal South Africa right now, and that was the concurrent consequence of the Rainbow Nation narrative, right? More than this, we tell you that we don't even have to prove to you that the Rainbow Nation South Africa is something that we want, but rather that it is an ideal that is important to uphold and for people to know so that they have a comparative to gauge what the reality is relative to what an ideal version of inclusion and unification is, right? So we don't actually have to defend this idea that South Africa is perfect right now and that we have enough reparation. The second response here is that we need to understand that some reparation has been achieved, that we do have things like affirmative action, but that more importantly, as much as it's not enough reparation, this reparation wouldn't have existed if the Rainbow Nation narrative hadn't come surface, right? And we tell you this for 3 reasons. We told you the 3 reasons of how this concept of reparation surfaces in itself, right? We told you firstly, you need to have both parties being able to feel comfortable in a way that they don't feel antagonized. Secondly, they need to be exposed to the reality of differences that will come to the table. And lastly, that because of these 2 things, you will be having a diplomacy that hinges on evaluation and thereby reparation. The second thing they told us was basically they told us that reparation was not a reality because the government was too scared to instate these things, right? And we have 2 responses here. Firstly, we tell you that this was just an assertion that the government formulates policies based on a narrative which we think is just dumb. But secondly, we tell you that what we need to understand here is that the prerequisite for this analysis would be that it was conceived as truth, right? We tell you that no, we don't think that for the public, but especially the government, that white people were now able to acknowledge their privilege, black people were now able to acknowledge their oppression, and it is in this that we further bring space, right? What we need to understand is that from 1652, black people and people of color were being dehumanized and stripped of their dignity. This means that by the stage of 1994, there had been 372 years during which they were indoctrinated into their own devaluation, but more importantly, the second thing here was that paternalism had become pertinent, and that was the way in which people gauged what their social status was, right? We tell you that the concept of paternalism hinges on the idea that you hand it to your oppressor to seek your own liberation. Like if you are liberated, it is due to your oppressor, and that is something that they must be credited for, right? To tell you why this is destructive is for two reasons. One, black people were indoctrinated into the idea that they were not equal, but secondly, that they were indoctrinated into the misconception that they should be reliant on their saviors, on their liberators, that were the white colonialists, right? But we tell you that how the dynamic changes with the rainbow nation narrative is based on the interaction that different races have with this narrative. So we've already shown you how white people have interacted with this narrative. What we further show you in this point is how black people have engaged with this narrative and how this has come to be their own empowerment through the acknowledgement of their oppression, right? We tell you that with black people, there were three things that happened. Firstly, they were able to understand that they were entitled to the same thing as they perceived as saviors, right? We find that this is incredibly important because it was more than just like the simple understanding that you are equal. It was in vast juxtaposition to what the indoctrination of paternalism meant, right? To understand that they were equal was something of such magnitude and not something that was easy for them to conclude, right? So we tell you that this was incredibly important for them to understand that they could come to the same table to discuss racial dynamics. Secondly, we told you that we granted them the ability to understand that they could have difference and that they don't need white people to explain their oppression to them, right? They could understand that they could have this difference, and thirdly, they were able to understand that they were at a position, because of the first level that I given you, to be able to expose that difference and expose what those differences meant in terms of a racial hierarchy. We tell you furthermore that having equal rights in a constitution was just not enough to ensure this mindset, because it simply meant that it was something that existed in policy, something that existed on paper, right? But more importantly, this legislation had to be implemented simultaneous to this narrative, because what this narrative meant simultaneous to legislation was two things. One, it meant that people were able to understand that their lived experience is something they could control and they could understand, and thus they could use their own understanding of oppression, acknowledgement of oppression, to empower themselves, that they wouldn't have to pander to their perceived savior to ensure their liberation. But secondly, that it gave them an avenue to wokeness, which Jordan has well spoken about. What we need to understand is a pot of gold at the end of this point is two things. One, it means that black people who thought that they were deserving of their oppression, because trust me, white people had indoctrinated them into this mentality. For these people who accepted their oppression and thought they were deserving of it, they were given a platform in which they could understand that that could change, that oppression could exist, and that they could get to a point where they could acknowledge that. For black people who had understood that they acknowledged their oppression at this stage, they were able to understand that they could mobilize that acknowledgement by speaking up about it and about using that acknowledgement to gain equality, right? This means that because of this black consciousness and the rainbow nation narrative has grown, we're able to have protests like Black Lives Matter, we're able to have protests like Peace Must Fall, and essentially we're able to have a debate like this, where white people and people of color are able to engage on these issues. Ladies and gentlemen, Gauteng is taking the
Can I just ask before the next speaker comes up, at the back, can you hear the speakers without the mic? No? So with the last speaker, please just hold the mic and use it, because it's very soft at the back. Thank you.
Order. Thank you for that speech. You call upon the third speaker.
It's really
funny to have an opposition that comes to us and talks to us about black consciousness, but simultaneously have to defend non-racialism. Black consciousness thinkers actively rejected the narrative of the Rainbow Nation because it advocates for togetherness in a time where there was need for separation. They needed to acknowledge this. We've told you this from the beginning. Gauteng is never going to win again. In my speech today, 3 arguments. Firstly, what is the Rainbow Nation? Opposition has no clue. Secondly, was the Rainbow Nation necessary for the end of apartheid and the reform of South Africa? But then thirdly, how the Rainbow Nation actively undermines equality in South Africa. So firstly, what is the Rainbow Nation? They tell us that the Rainbow Nation is not saying that we are equal, but is saying that we need to be equal in the future. And while that might be the case, what they needed to recognize was the mechanism behind traveling to equality, right? That mechanism that the Rainbow Nation narrative advocates for is one of non-racialism, saying that we are all people, so we're going to be people together and that's going to be fun. We say in that situation, that is advocating for non-racialism. We say in that situation, you can't advocate for that, because non-racialism doesn't work when there's such rampant divides among races. We tell you that after apartheid, we needed something much better. Secondly, they tell you that while it's saying that we're different, but we can be equal and we can be united in some way. We tell you in this situation that the emphasis on togetherness that a rainbow insinuates is something that is detrimental, something that is detrimental to the own principles that they advocate for when they talk about black consciousness, right? Because when we're talking about trying to be together, that can't happen when we're not equal yet. The Rainbow Nation said that we're going to be unified now. We tell you that that's something that we can't advocate for. We tell you what we needed after apartheid was a degree of separateness. We tell you that we needed black academics to have their own spaces, to develop their own ideology, to not be drowned out by the same white people that had oppressed them during apartheid. You didn't get that because we went with the narrative that said, well, we're going to be together now, apartheid's over, let's have fun. That didn't work. We tell you in those situations, that's something that's harmful. Moreover, what they needed to recognize is that the kinds of parties who advocated for this policy were non-racial parties. The ANC is a non-racial party. The NP wanted to make good and pretend to be non-racial. We tell you in these situations, this is a non-racial and ineffective policy. We tell you that the Rainbow Nation is so regrettable. But even if we're wrong, we tell you 2 things. Firstly, we tell you that people on a massive scale have misinterpreted what the Rainbow Nation has meant. Even though they would like to talk to you about, oh, it's just Cape Town. Cape Town is a large city and one of the most unequal cities in the country. Why do we not care about the upliftment of black people in Cape Town? We should care about that kind of thing. You can't get that with the Rainbow Nation narrative because people have misinterpreted and are saying it that like we are now equal just because apartheid's over, and it's obviously false. We say that the only kind of rejection we've been getting of the narrative has only come 20 years after apartheid. That is way too long. A whole generation of people have grown up in dismal conditions. That's not fair. You can never advocate for that. But secondly, what we tell you is that this Rainbow Nation narrative has still led us to this point. It has still led us to the point at which black people are still earning 7 times less than white people. Tell you that these are the kinds of things that they needed to recognize, these kinds of social ills that still plague our society, that Neve detailed to you in her speech, that weren't engaged with. We tell you that they needed to engage with what this country actually looks like. This country is dramatically unequal. And we say in that situation, they misunderstand what the Rainbow Nation narrative is. They needed to understand that to win this debate. But secondly, was this necessary for the end of apartheid, and was it necessary to reform South Africa? So they tell us about things like a violent revolution, and then try to claim that it's something that we're advocating for. But what we tell you is violent revolution is not something we support, firstly, but secondly, it's something that wasn't going to happen in the first place. I recommended they open a history textbook, because white people at the time were not keen on apartheid either. The economy was in recession. There were sanctions on South Africa. Businesses were pulling out of South Africa at a rapid pace. People were not keen on us anymore, right? In that situation, white people were actually beginning to suffer for the first time in the history of South Africa. We tell you that in that situation, they were advocating for change because they weren't able to survive anymore either. We tell you that then violent revolution wasn't necessary. We tell you that it wasn't then necessary to make this compromise just to avoid some sort of violent revolution. On a second level then, they tell us that, well, we needed white people to come along to the struggle with us, and we needed to appease them in some way. 2 responses. Firstly, they wanted apartheid to end, they need to engage with reality. But secondly, how dare they say that we need to bow to the oppressors for our own liberation. We say that their own advocation for black consciousness would say that we don't need to pander to our oppressors just to gain liberation. We tell you that if that's the sole reason that they support the Rainbow Nation, we tell you that's not good enough. We tell you that people of color should have fought harder and refused to compromise with the people who had oppressed them for centuries. We tell you that's not legitimate. We tell you that's not something we would ever support. Thirdly, they tell us about the IFP. They tell us that, well, the IFP was going to overthrow the government, there was going to be a violent revolution, so we needed to appease them in some way. We tell you that largely the IFP wanted a separate homeland for the Zulu people. We tell you they didn't get that, and they didn't have a violent revolution. You need to engage with reality yet again. We suggest that they take history and drop whatever subjects they're taking at the moment. Lastly, they tell us about, well, there's constant inequality in the world, so there's no way that people are actually denying that that exists. So clearly the Rainbow Nation can't be creating that kind of blindness. So we say that it's kind of strange for them to say that the inequality is so clear to everyone, but then say that simultaneously that this narrative is necessary. If it is so clear to everyone, why did we need to make this kind of narrative to let them know that it's true? We tell you rather what this narrative did is it said, we can be all equal and together, guys, it's going to be fun. And we tell you that that's not something that was productive. That was something that led white people to thinking that they were absolved of those sins, because they now just bought into an idea that we're all the beautiful and colorful rainbow. We tell you that that's not true. Then, thirdly, why does this actively undermine equality in South Africa? So firstly, they tell us that, well, it creates a comparative between the status quo and some sort of ideal and something to work towards. Firstly, we'd like to point out that this is often, not often, always, phrased in the present tense. People say we are part of the Rainbow Nation. South Africa is the Rainbow Nation. Every State of the Nation address, every Olympic Games, every World Cup, we talk about going as the Rainbow Nation. That is phrased in the present tense. It's not an ideal people are working towards. It's something that people say that we have now. That's false. But secondly, what we tell you is it becomes a bedrock for policy, right? That's why things like BEE has failed, because it fails to recognize that we needed a large-scale change of our system, right? That's why BEE only uplifted a couple of executives, but not the black working class. We tell you in those situations, we needed that kind of policy to be based on something a lot better, based on something that actually cared about black people. Then, secondly, they tell us that while black people needed to acknowledge their own oppression, and this is how we did that, through things like black consciousness. Exactly. We would have preferred a situation where we went with black consciousness, where that entire frame of reference for our society became one of black consciousness, of acknowledging that we are of different races, and that we need to work towards some sort of equality, but through things like separatism, through things like emphasizing differences, but not discriminating based on it. I think these are the kinds of things that black consciousness advocates for, and would have been a lot better in terms of changing the system that we have. Last, we'd like to point out that any kind of social unity that they thought that they got by talking about a Rainbow Nation is an irrelevant one, because we could have gotten that unity while solving economic ills. We didn't solve those economic ills. The social unity we have is one that is false. You must stand with the Western people.
Explain. I hope she can get through her maths other side. And I know she will.
She looks excited. I think she's set up for this.
The only black person in this debate, let's bring back reality, right? You can never tell me that black consciousness is the best argument for this debate, because black consciousness asks for just because you're pro-black does not mean you're anti-white. It's literally in each and every picture of black consciousness. But secondly, the wrong strategy that Western Cape chose to choose was the fact that, hey, right, these people are unhappy, but moreover, that the Rainbow Nation that we receive from this side of the house is the misrepresentation are the Rainbow Nation, and this is something that is comparatively better. 2 questions to evaluate this debate. 1, what the Rainbow Nation narrative means for black majority. And this is very important because it underlines the importance of minority, but more importantly, a narrative. Secondly, was the narrative inherent to establishing wokeness? Because understanding that, hey, you live in a society with other people, we're not just going to say that, hey, you must separate yourself in order for equality to exist, is simply BS, right? We think that the mere fact that there's an achievement of equality, at least an attempt to it, was because people were given an ability to be woke. With that in mind, then, what South Africa would have actually surpassed after apartheid would have been created. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about if Nelson Mandela was like, no guys, like Rainbow Nation must exist, what would have happened? 1, Inkatha would have won. And what does that mean, right? It means that both black individuals, like both societies of the blacks, so this is Xhosa individuals and Zulu individuals, would fight. What this means is that already white people have an ability to try and demoralize it and say, you fight for democracy, but you're still fighting amongst yourselves, right? We think that the importance of that point is the fact that understanding that just because we're purporting for like the Rainbow Nation does not mean it was only exclusive to black and white groups within society. It also actually went to the degree between ethnicities within that ladies and gentlemen, we acted for this. So on the first point of what the narrative, what the Rainbow Nation narrative means for black majority, and my conclusion here is to simply tell you that the black people were willing to actually compromise the fact that they constantly have to live with very racist individuals like them that opt for protecting them while aligning, right, in order for them to achieve the equality that they so deserve. We're talking about reparation that they rightly deserve, but secondly, a society where we're still able to feed off of your whiteness if it means that we're able to achieve blackness, right? So the first example here is that of black consciousness. And why this is a very particularly bad example is the fact that you must look at the success of the ANC. So we're not saying the ANC is perfect, but they were able to succumb to the idea and humble themselves and say that we'll actually interact with the gap if it means that black people will be liberated at the end of the day. While this is important, however, it's not saying that we are all hail the white people. No, it says that we're willing to settle our differences for the change that is very important for South Africa. We're willing to accept that you are our oppressors, but we have to feed off of you. You're rich, what can we say? We think that, ladies and gentlemen, this is inherently important. But secondly, what does the Rainbow Nation look like? And this is a very insulting, because the Rainbow Nation that they talked about is the Rainbow Nation in the Western Cape. Let's bring it back to the whole country, right? The Rainbow Nation that we're talking about in this debate is the Rainbow Nation that simply addresses the idea, like people, like these minorities and majority groups are not numb to the fact that oppression was something that existed. This is why Jordan's speech and Neha's speech is very important, because it established that black people want to be worked, so they don't want the fact that their ideals or what they stand for should be nullified by the fact that the Rainbow Nation exists. They want the Rainbow Nation to exist for that public discourse that they actively want. That's why we're able to get very racist individuals like the Red October represent themselves in the public debate, but still have black consciousness movements of black individuals within that spectrum and within that crowd to listen to that oppressive white man and still be able to challenge him. This is what wokeness in the Rainbow Nation actually looks like. But also a response. Guys, Rainbow Nation has multiple colors. So this means that we're not just combining them and creating a very odd green or blue color. We're creating the fact that we could recognize there's pink, yellow, and whatever. What that means is the fact that we are able to be unified in acknowledging that, one, these people have privilege, but that does not mean that we must actually forget the struggle or the oppression that black individuals went through. But more importantly is to understand that we must also unify the black community, because after apartheid, the Inkatha was like, yo, we are separating from you guys because you simply want peace with these white individuals. Why this would have happened and why the example of how white people wanted to form coalition is very important in this debate, because it simply undermines the fact that white people were not happy that black people were liberated. It's not true, right? Just because you claim that they were doesn't mean it's true. What actually happened tangibly was the fact that they were trying constantly to secure themselves a position within that society, which meant that they had to engage with the Rainbow Nation in order to still feed off of that state. So we're not saying it's good, but it was able to create the identity for South Africa as a whole, were comparatively better. Now, what Stephen has successfully done is show how white he is. things. I'm sorry to say this, right? Because ultimately, it just says that, well, these people's voices are drowned out, and white people are inherently want to coexist, right? This is not true. The mere fact that there are still white individuals that are able to put a black man in a coffin simply shows that the narrative should exist, right? It's not, you see, the same people that defied the idea of the narrative were the same people that put that poor black individual within the coffin. What has that Rainbow Nation done? It has established a sense of acknowledgement that we can never let the white minority actually take over that. So if without the Rainbow Nation, what would have happened? The separation that you actually want. One, white people would still think that they're right in apartheid, right? Two, apartheid would have never ended because then Big Carter would try to constantly fight the causes of the ANC. Ladies and gentlemen, this is something that's tangibly harmful because it simply does not acknowledge that post-apartheid, the aftermath of apartheid is something that's inherently harmful. So one, to the economy, but both to the social capital within that state. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about trying to fix our differences, not forgetting the past, but being able to work forward. That's why Nelson Mandela was like, no, we can work with the girl. Like, it doesn't mean that just because he's white, he's not able to actually protect the black majority, right? That's what change actually created. But secondly, that correlation meant that the black people in support of the ANC were willing to work with the white minority. What did they tell us instead? That BEE doesn't work, that affirmative action does not work. Can we go back to Vilagazi Street and acknowledge that BEE actually does work? It does not work perfectly, but we're only 20 years into democracy. Why do you expect a perfect democracy just in the 20 years? And I was like, we think that, ladies and gentlemen, we need to be woke about this. Second issue of contention, that of inherently establishing wokeness. And what we must understand here is that they say that there's false unity. What false unity means is that we numb to things like debating. One. Two, false unity means that things like the Constitution are the only barrier to which individuals can actually engage with each other. So we're telling you that their harms are only established because the Constitution was established before the continuation of the narrative of the Rainbow Nation. Because the Constitution literally restricted individuals and said, y'all need to be equal whether or not you like it. What the Rainbow narrative actually created was the fact that there is a moral obligation to each other in order for that coexistence to exist. Ladies and gentlemen, this is inherently important. And also, it's very insulting for them to say that, well, the economic ills were what resulted in the white minority supporting black people. No, they were scared, right? They were scared shitless because they understood that should separation exist, they're going to have to go back to Europe where they still don't have a position within that society anyways. Within that, we were able to accept them besides their differences because we understand that we can never just achieve absolute equality, but we damn right have a possibility of achieving it. Ladies and gentlemen, there's no change that the side of the house will create because apartheid will have continued. Side opposition is for black consciousness, side opposition wins this debate. Thank you.
But moreover, we need to understand what the Rainbow Nation narrative means. Because yes, it's about non-racialism, yes, it's about unity through difference. But what's specifically important is that it's not a positive statement about what society exists as today. It does not say that we are equal, it says that this is where we ought to be. We ought to be at a position where we are inherently equal, which is why the government of South Africa is adopting policies such as BEE. If that was true and they were completely non-racial, that wouldn't be the case. So what we need to understand is the value of an ideal which says that we should all exist within the same society, specifically emerging from post-apartheid South Africa. In evaluating my side opposition on Gauteng win this debate, I'm going to be evaluating why the harm is not greater than the good of the Rainbow Nation. In terms of the harm, we need to understand that they argue two major things. They argue that the Rainbow Nation narrative is the bedrock of current South African government policy, but secondly, it harms discourse in the new South Africa. But simultaneously, they argue in Stephen's speech that currently people are questioning the Rainbow Nation narrative, that currently some people are rejecting it. On that basis, they tell us that the Rainbow Nation narrative isn't permanent. What that tells us is that it might have been a valuable tool to get out of apartheid, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a movement to the future. So according to their own analysis, we don't think that there's substantial harm to the future. We think that even if there has been 20 years of roadblock, that's still 100 and infinity years of progress. But secondly, we need to understand how these arguments simply aren't true. We tell you that the bedrock of policy of the South African government isn't simply based on an ideology. It's based on the improvement of people's lives on the consideration that they should be equal, which is why we have policies such as BEE. Sure, they're not entirely effective, but they're pretty damn well hung. Secondly, we need to understand discourse. They tell us that white people are incredibly dismissive in conversations, and on that basis, it harms the whole of South Africa. We told you specifically how black people aren't submissive, just ask Kula. What that means is that they're not allowing their struggles and oppression to be misrepresented within society. So sure, if white people try to white-explain what being black means, people are going to shut them down. That's incredibly important because if they tell us about overcoming protests, what that means is that black people rise to the top to overcome that. Which is why all of the protest leaders for Peace Must Fall, except for the open up bits, were black. That's incredibly important for achieving discourse within society. So based on their harms not being too tangible within today's debate, let's talk about what the good ones. And the most important one within this debate was the emergence from apartheid. Because they constantly tell us that white people wanted to engage in negotiations and therefore they were willing to dismantle the entire regime, which had benefited them for 350 years. We need to understand in this situation, we gave you 4 substantial reasons as to why any other policy or white engagement would never have fixed this. We told you one about how there was oppression and subjugation of black political will. That organizations were incredibly hard to form, but more of a protest, and appeals to appeal to that majority within the public were incredibly difficult. Secondly, we told you, and this was largely unresponded, is that there were divisions within people of color in South Africa. The Inkatha Freedom Party was fighting against the ANC. And Michaela was entirely wrong when she said it wasn't so bad, because people were literally being slaughtered in their homes. That's incredibly problematic because we were on the verge of a civil war, not just with white South Africa, but with black South Africa. That's specifically problematic in terms of creating a unified government for the future, which happened in the elections. Secondly, we need to understand, or thirdly, we need to understand under this point, why securing white capital was incredibly important. We told you how white people would be afraid in this situation, and how they were afraid. In this situation, it was important to subdue them and tell them that everything would be okay, pat them on the head so they would keep their money in our country. What's incredibly important there is that reparations aren't impossible, but a slow and continuous progress happening. We don't think that white people are going to be continuing to secure their supremacy in society. We think that's constantly being broken down. But fourthly, we told you that the Rainbow Nation narrative emerged at the perfect time to create change. But moreover, we tell you about black consciousness and about how the Rainbow Nation gives us a tool to deconstruct the system of dehumanization created by apartheid. If you care about the freedom of black people within today's society, you understand the Rainbow Nation is nothing but good.
Yes!
Let's just take a second to look in the mirror and reflect upon the Rainbow Nation that we live in. A Rainbow Nation where black people are put into coffins. A Rainbow Nation when we can all debate together, but are we truly unified? The idea is here that we're dealing with a highly divided society. We're dealing with a society that's complicated and difficult to deal with. What the Rainbow Nation does is it ignores all the complexities and the nuances that are needed to be understood in order to get to the point that we need to be. So I'm going to talk about 2 things in this reply. Firstly, was the Rainbow Nation necessary in order to transition from the end of apartheid into post-apartheid South Africa? And secondly, does it harm transformation and has it harmed transformation? So firstly, they tell you that this was required in order to make white people happy. We gave you multiple reasons why this wasn't true. We're saying that the majority of white electoral voters that were willing to participate in negotiations towards the end of apartheid was because of the pressures that they were facing, not only from the international community, because they were being moral outliers to the rest of the world, but also because of economic and financial pressures. We think that the violence that was caused by white people was on a specific minority, that of the RVFB and the Conservative Party, not a necessary threat in order towards entire civil war. They say that the IFP needed the Rainbow Nation to be kept happy. The IFP joined the elections and concealed their differences before the Rainbow Nation came into effect. We think that we need to understand those differences as well. Like, the IFP's disagreements weren't based on ideas about identity and racialism. They were based on the ideas of having separate homelands. And when they didn't get it, they considered and went into the elections anyway. So we think that their historical context here is backwards, it's wayward, and it's not really something which indicates that the Rainbow Nation is a necessary compromise. But secondly, we think it's very difficult here is that the Rainbow Nation is actively harming our abilities to transform. They are wrong when they say that the Rainbow Nation isn't something which serves as an agenda to set future policy. Because that's exactly how you set policy. You say, what is the type of society that we want, and then how can we get there? What the Rainbow Nation did was it said that this is what we want, and let's try and establish certain policies to get there under that framework. What did that mean? No land redistribution. What did that mean? And then failed BEE, which is stagnating and unable to be particularly successful. It means that the redistribution that we require, the business tax that we require, not something that we've gotten. We told you that a necessary and maybe beneficial alternative to this would be a mantra of black consciousness. We get an argument in their second speech about why this would be a good thing, and no one blinks an eye. It's exactly what we're advocating for. The problem with the Rainbow Nation is that it is completely antithetical to the ideas of black consciousness. It advocates unity as opposed to temporary separatism before empowerment. All of those ideas are completely anti what those fees-must-fall leaders suggest. They don't like the Rainbow Nation. All of those leaders, like Steve Biko, they don't like the Rainbow Nation. It's an active rejection of those beliefs, which has put those people in individual positions where they've been able to challenge the pre-existing systems of oppression. So we think that the same thing happens at a more minor level. It happens not only at the systemic level, but it happens, as I explained in my argument, at the individual level as well. It's the problem that we have with this debate here about its representation. All of those problems as a result of seeing each other as all equal and seeing each other like there aren't individual differences that need to be treated with differently and equitably. All of those problems are associated with the belief that we are not inherently different, and after the laws of apartheid were taken away, there are differences that need to be dealt with systemically. Once those problems have been taken away, that's when we can start encouraging social adhesion and social unity. There needs to be that real reform, and without it, we'll never get meaningful change. So we think that the Rainbow Nation not only has failed, it has continued to be misrepresented and misunderstood by the people in power. And because of that, those systems of power have been entrenched forever. And we think that those problems have been absolutely and necessarily harmful. Two things that we've shown to you today. Firstly, the Rainbow Nation wasn't necessary in order to end apartheid. We had alternative mechanisms of doing so. And secondly, it is actively non-transformation. Very proud to oppose.